Bonjour. But essentially, what I wanted to do was help explain the sexual revolution, particularly as it manifests itself in our current transgender moment, to Christians, interested non-Christians, and to set the sexual revolution within a broader sweep of the intellectual history of Europe over the last 300 years. Yeah, well, with all history books, the problem of the starting point is always one of the most difficult things, because wherever you start, there's always a backstory. So you have to start somewhere. Could have definitely have started with Descartes. I think the big thing for me is this inward movement that takes place really from the late Middle Ages onwards, but we find it expressed particularly sharply by Descartes in his quest for certainty. So I could have gone back to Descartes. I chose Rousseau because what Rousseau does that Descartes doesn't is two things. One, Rousseau really emphasizes the emotions. And I think a lot of what we see today is, to simplify it, is emotionally driven. It's about feelings and desires. And Rousseau is really a superb figure for articulating that. He also inspired a very influential cultural movement we now call Romanticism. And I think one of the things that we can see with Rousseau is that his ideas become part of popular culture, partly because he inspires these great artistic figures, the French romantics, German romantics. I focus on English romantics in the book because they're the ones I'm most familiar with, but you could certainly tell the romantic story from a French or from a German perspective. So that was why I went for Rousseau. We tend to think in terms of authenticity of the self now, and that's really a big Rousseau kind of idea, I think. Yeah, of course, one of the pleasures of writing a book like this is that I get to write on the figures with me, and Marx and Freud have always fascinated me. Marx is interesting for a number of reasons. I think one, he's part of a movement within the 19th century, stemming in large part from Hegel, but not exclusively from Hegel, that really sees human nature as something plastic, as something generated by historical circumstances, rather than having a stable moral structure throughout time. So Marx is very important on that front. Secondly, he's very important for politicizing everything. When Marx says, what essentially makes you you are the economic relations you have, where you stand in the system of economic production. That's the most fundamental thing about you. What he really does there is he, to use the phrase, he abolishes the pre-political. Everything from the Boy Scout troop in your town upwards becomes political. And I think that's where we are today. We tend to think of everything as political in the world we now live. Freud is critical because he's the man who more than anybody hates the notion that yes, you are, as Rousseau thought, we are our inner desires and feelings, but guess what? The most fundamental aspect of those inner desires and feelings is that they're dark and sexual. And Freud really helps fashion that notion of the self, where sex ceases to become an activity and becomes a fundamental part of your identity. If you read the Bible, sex is really treated in the Bible as an activity. It's something people do. There are correct ways of doing it, and there are immoral ways of doing it in the Bible, but it's not asserted as an identity. We now routinely think in terms of straight, gay, lesbian, bi. These are identity terms that really require us to see our sexual desires as being the fundamentally constitutive part of who we are as selves. Yes, I mean, that's a huge question. Sartre has always interested me, really more for his novels and his plays than his philosophy. He's a great writer. He was a real literary talent. I think he's somewhat passé now. I don't see Sartre as a force today. His distinction between existence and essence, I think, is central to modern thought, but it's not unique to him. It's become part and parcel of how an awful lot of people think. I would say Simone de Beauvoir, who's often seen in some ways as kind of playing second fiddle to, she was the companion of Sartre. I'm almost inclined to say, Sartre was the companion of Simone de Beauvoir. She's a more significant thinker. particularly on feminism and the way that the transgender question and gender theory has developed. De Beauvoir's Second Sex is an absolutely foundational text for that. And that would point me then to Foucault. I think Foucault is fundamental to notions of gender theory today. Foucault, I have his history of sexuality on my desk in front of me. I'm rereading it for a little article I'm going to do on him. I think he's very important. His transfer to the United States is sort of odd, because I read French thinkers as very much writing against the background of the occupation and the traumas of the 20th century. And I see them in some ways as kind of pessimistic and dark. Their move to America is odd, because America was traditionally a very optimistic country and hasn't had the sort of recent trauma of occupation. So Foucault has taken on a life of his own in the United States, I think. I find him a very stimulating thinker. I think his notion of discourses of power is very interesting, and one that Christians can learn from, because we know that human beings are sinful, and therefore even our most altruistic actions are tainted with a little bit of sin and a little bit of a manipulative dimension. So I wouldn't dismiss Foucault. And I think he's very, very important, particularly for the way people like Judith Butler in the United States construct their notions of gender and have paved the way for gender theory. I should also add that I think French philosophy is far more interesting than Anglo-American stuff on the whole. I'm much more interested in Sartre and Hegel's German, but those guys, than the Anglo-American logic. That bores me to tears. Yeah, that's a very good question. And I'd have to preface my answer by saying, don't read my book as being a sort of story of decline. It's a descriptive book. And what I would want to say about the kind of self that we see emerging in the 18th century with Rousseau and company, this emphasis on inner feelings, is that's not entirely bad. We are feeling beings. Emotions are important. And one of the important things that happens in the 18th century, on the one hand, you have Rousseau and the Romantics. On the Christian side, you have the rise of the evangelical revivals. And Wesley, Whitefield, Jonathan Edwards, what are they doing? They're emphasizing the emotions. And that's not an entirely bad thing. We are emotional beings. And it also helps bring out the urgency of the gospel and the need to existentially close with the gospel in a way that was muted in the Middle Ages, and even to some extent, I think, in the Reformation. So the first thing I'd want to say is not all aspects of this expressive emotional self are wrong. It's a phenomenon. It's neither good nor bad. It depends which way you take it. The dangers, I think, are that we can end up moving from the expressive individual to a notion that the purpose of life is therapeutic, that the reason for everything is ultimately that I should feel happy and I should have an inner sense of psychological satisfaction, that the church is there to make me feel good about myself. Trying to be sort of, we're Western Europeans, we're naturally pessimistic, and we're inclined to say, no, the purpose of the church is to make you feel bad about yourself. It's to point out that you're not what you should be. It's to explain the misery of this world to you. And there is a real danger, and I can't comment on France, because the French situation is no doubt very different to America, but certainly in America, where there are so many churches to choose from, which is a good thing. Freedom of religion is a good thing, but it does tend to make churches competitors in a customer-driven marketplace. And that has tended over time in America to make churches cater to, guess what? Making people feel good about themselves. So there's a real danger, I think, that the expressive individual, which provides good things, it allows us to think about the gospel in urgent personal terms, can also at times tilt towards seeing the gospel as kind of religious version of psychological therapy to make us feel happy. That's not Paul's take in 1st and 2nd Corinthians, particularly 2nd Corinthians, where he talks about present suffering. And the present suffering is not trivial, but it's nothing compared to the glory that is to come. It's the glory to come that makes the present suffering bearable and worthwhile. Excellent questions to which there are no simple and straightforward answers. To the first half, I would say Christians need to be self-disciplined on one level. We need to not become just a religious reflection of the angry world around us. I've become very conscious in my own writing over the last couple of years. Take out the adjectives, man, tone it down, keep a calm voice, even when you're being goaded. So I think Christians need to not take the angry bait. And my book is a very calm book from that perspective. I think the church needs to be, I like to think of the church not so much as involved in culture war as being an arena of cultural protest. We protest the culture by being that which the culture is not. We love each other. We care for each other. We look after each other. We speak with kindness to those outside. So I think that's going to be a very important part of the church's response to the current climate. It's not just a question of finding the magic idea that will persuade everybody we have the truth. I think it's demonstrating a better way in the way we hold ourselves, the way we relate to each other. The second part of your question, was about pronouns. Difficult to generalize. I could see a situation where I'm faced with somebody who says, I'm not even going to listen to you unless you use my preferred pronoun. And that faces you as a pastor with a tough situation. Do you cut off the conversation there on that point? Or do you find a way around it? I could envisage, I'm not saying that this should happen every time or even in a majority of cases, I could certainly envisage a situation where I would say to that person, I am going to use your preferred pronoun. I really don't agree with what you're doing, but for the sake of the conversation I think we need to have, I'm willing to make that concession for you. I could see hypothetically a situation where that might occur. So on the pronoun issue, I'm a work in progress on that. And I think probably it isn't a question of one size fits all. I definitely tilt towards no, I'm going to use the real pronoun because I don't want to go along with your deception. But I don't want to rule out a circumstance where, as a short-term tactical move, if you like, it might be worth making that concession just to keep a conversation going. I think all Christians, we have to think in these situations that when we cut off a conversation with somebody, they're no longer going to talk to us, they're going to talk to them. And I think in every conversation, that point may come at some point, but we need to make sure it's the right point. We need to take that stand at the right moment and not a moment too soon. Sure. On the first question, I mean, I'm not familiar really with sort of Eastern Asian societies in general. I imagine that a lot of these developments will be coming to those societies because of the internet, because of they're connected to technology, they're connected to consumerism. These things are spreading. On the other hand, we now know that the American model, which has been the sort of assumed to be the wave of the future. We now know that the American model is facing significant challenges. Modernity looks very different in India, that's emerging as a strong, powerful, modern economy at this point. Modernity looks very different in China. Modernity looks very different in Russia. Even American modernity is changing as big business is assuming more and more of a direct political role. Democracy is being challenged. The American notion of democracy is being challenged in a way that nobody could ever have envisaged. So I think the question of how this will spread, who knows? Who knows? I really don't know at this point. In terms of books to read, I think Charles Taylor is masterful in his analysis of the self. Now, unfortunately, Charles Taylor has never had the editors that he needs. His great books are massively long, even longer than mine, twice the size of mine. I would recommend, if you really want to get into Taylor, though, get hold of his small book. It's in America, it's The Ethics of Authenticity. In Europe, I think it's The Malaise of Modernity. That takes you to the heart of his thinking about the self. Then get hold of James K.A. Smith's book, How Not to Be Secular, which is a guide to Taylor's massive tome, A Secular Age. And then if you really want to dive in and wrestle with Taylor's thinking in depth, his book, Sources of the Self, and its sequel, A Secular Age, both wonderful. And in addition to those, I would also recommend Philip Rieff, Triumph of the Therapeutic. Rieff does not write English well. It's a hard book to read, but The Triumph of the Therapeutic is an amazing analysis, really, of where the modern world has taken its cue from in terms of how it understands things like happiness and where happiness is to be found. I think we're still seeing the outworking of the thinking of people like Michel Foucault in the work of Judith Butler and company. So I think we will continue to see further philosophical reflection on gender. And I think that will be extended to, I won't say to sort of species, but I do think the work of Butler and company will have implications beyond our understanding of humanity. I think the rise of robotics is very important. Now, I'm not sure who is the cutting edge in that, but it's distasteful to talk about sex robots. But that raises all kinds of interesting ethical questions for society. As a Christian, is it adultery to use a sex robot? How do we parse that kind of moral question? And so I think the area to look at really for philosophy, interesting philosophy anyway, will be ethical thinking relative to the development of robotics. Who knows where that will go, but that's the leading edge, I think, of what's going to happen in the future.